She was struggling in the mud with a broken wheelbarrow, pretending she had everything under control, and Elias had to decide whether to respect her pride or ignore it and help anyway. Elias Cruz was backing his dented Parks Department dump truck into the gravel lot behind Lincoln Middle School on a Saturday morning in early October, and before he'd even killed the engine, he was already running through calculations in his head that had nothing to do with the mulch delivery he was supposed to be making. His phone was sitting on the dashboard with his bank app still open from when he'd checked it at 6 this morning, $743, showing in his checking account until the next paycheck hit in 12 days, and his son Leo's asthma inhaler refills were due Tuesday. He dropped his city coverage to save on premiums, which would eat $90 of that, leaving him to stretch what was left across groceries and gas and the electric bill he'd been avoiding for 2 weeks straight. He was 35 years old and had been working maintenance for the city park system for going on 6 years now, wore a safety orange vest over a hoodie that had definitely seen better days, and most of his weekdays involved fixing broken sprinkler heads and hauling wood chips to community gardens that seemed to only get used by the handful of people dedicated enough to show up on weekends. He checked the rearview mirror to make sure he wasn't about to run over any of those weekend volunteers, and that's when he spotted her across the lot, a woman who looked maybe early 30s, absolutely wrestling with what had to be the most beat-up wheelbarrow he'd seen outside of a junkyard. She was wearing jeans that were covered in mud up to the knees and a faded marching band t-shirt that had seen too many wash cycles, and she was trying to force this ancient wheelbarrow through a section of garden that was less dirt and more straight-up mud pit. And even from where Elias was sitting, he could tell this was a losing battle. The wheelbarrow was piled so high with wet soil, it was a miracle it hadn't tipped already, and the wheels were sinking deeper into the muck with every inch she managed to push forward, her whole body weight leaning into the handles like she was trying to move a car out of a ditch. Sadie Fletcher had dragged herself out of bed at 6 that morning, and it was pushing 9 now, and she'd managed to accomplish exactly nothing except confirming that her 15-year-old sedan still made that awful grinding sound when the engine turned over, and that this community garden project she'd volunteered for was in way worse shape than the principal had let on during that staff meeting 3 weeks back. She taught middle school band during the week, spent her evenings grading and planning lessons, and her nights doing budget math on a teacher's salary that barely kept her mortgage current, and she'd raised her hand to take on clearing this overgrown disaster behind the school building because the principal had mentioned it needed doing, and literally nobody else had volunteered. The principal had emailed her a basic volunteer form and told her to use whatever tools were stored in the equipment shed around back, which turned out to contain exactly one ancient wheelbarrow and a rusted rake. 5 years ago, when her entire life had imploded, she'd made herself this ironclad promise that she would never put herself in a position where she needed to depend on another person for anything, would solve her own problems and pull her own weight and never owe anyone. And up until right now, that philosophy had worked out perfectly fine, except for moments like this when she was 90% sure her arms were about to give out. The wheelbarrow's rusted wheel mount gave way with a sound like a snapping branch, the axle shearing off the hub entirely, and the whole thing just collapsed sideways in slow motion, dumping what felt like 300 pounds of cold, wet dirt all over both her sneakers and up past her ankles. Sadie stood there with her hands still locked around the splintered wooden handles, gripping them so hard her knuckles had gone completely white, and her shoulders sagged forward as she let out this long, slow breath through her teeth that was equal parts frustration and bone-deep exhaustion. She absolutely refused to turn her head and acknowledge the city truck she'd heard rumbling into the lot a few minutes ago, refused to make eye contact or signal in any way that she was struggling or needed assistance, just planted her feet in the mud with that busted wheelbarrow and her pride wrapped around her like armor. Elias watched the whole collapse happen and felt that automatic reflex kick in, the same one that made him actually check if sprinklers were hitting plants instead of just pavement, made him pull over when he saw someone with a flat tire, even when he was already running late. He shut off the engine and reached into the truck bed for his shovel, the good fiberglass handle one that didn't tear up your hands. The mulch could sit in the truck for another 20 minutes, he'd unload it after. He headed across the wet grass without making a big announcement about it, or turning it into some kind of rescue mission. When he got close enough that she couldn't pretend he wasn't there, he jammed the shovel blade down into the dirt right next to the wreckage of the wheelbarrow, and said in a voice that was matter of fact and completely stripped of drama, "If we start from the left side and work across, we can probably clear this whole mess in maybe 10 minutes. Name's Elias, by the way." Sadie finally looked up, and her immediate reflex was to tell him she had everything under control and didn't need any help, but the words got jammed up somewhere between her brain and her mouth because this guy wasn't standing there with pity written all over his face or waiting for her to be grateful. He was just looking at the pile of dirt like it was a straightforward problem with an obvious solution. "I've got it handled," she said anyway, because those words were practically a reflex at this point, and Elias just shrugged one shoulder and started moving dirt with his shovel anyway, scooping it up and redistributing it into the garden bed in these steady, efficient movements that made it pretty clear he did this exact kind of labor every single day. "Didn't say you couldn't handle it," he said, without pausing his work or bothering to look at her. "Just figured 2 shovels work faster than one. Plus, I'm already here and that mulch in my truck isn't going anywhere. I'm on the clock for the city, so technically you're paying my salary through your taxes anyway." Sadie stood there for another handful of seconds, with her arms hanging at her sides, her pride throwing a fit against the reality that her shoulders were screaming, and this complete stranger had already moved more dirt in 45 seconds than she'd managed to shift in the past hour. She bent down and grabbed one of the broken wooden handles from the destroyed wheelbarrow, started using the splintered end to scrape and push soil toward the area where Elias was working, and they fell into this unspoken rhythm that didn't require negotiation or acknowledgement that she was accepting help from someone whose last name she didn't even know yet. They worked side by side for close to an hour, and the conversation came in fits and starts between shovelfuls, and Sadie learned his full name was Elias Cruz, and he'd grown up in this neighborhood before the city had done anything useful with these parks, and he had a 7-year-old son named Leo who was currently parked at his grandmother's apartment watching Saturday morning cartoons. Elias learned she was Sadie Fletcher, and she taught band at the middle school, and she'd taken on this garden cleanup project solo because the district didn't have landscaping budget, and she figured maybe students would actually use the space if it didn't look like something out of a zombie movie. "My kid goes to Riverside Elementary," Elias said while moving another load of dirt. "He's in 2nd grade, and he's got this thing where he taps on literally everything. Constant drumming on desks and walls and car windows. His teacher said the patterns aren't random either. Same sequences every time. She mentioned it at conferences, like it's a problem. But I keep thinking music lessons might help channel that. They run like $80 a month though, and that's just not in the budget right now." Sadie stopped scraping dirt and straightened up, wiping her muddy hands on her jeans without really thinking about it. She said, "I teach beginner percussion after school a couple days a week, usually for my band students, but I've worked with younger kids before. If your son wanted to come by on Tuesdays or Thursdays, I wouldn't charge you for it. Kids who need to tap usually really need to tap. Might as well teach them how to do it with some kind of purpose." Elias actually stopped shoveling and turned to look at her head on for the first time since they'd started working. "You're serious about that?" "Because that would legitimately help a lot, but I can't just take free lessons from you. What if I came by your place on weekends and took care of some of that maintenance stuff? I'm over on Oak Street, so if you're anywhere nearby, I could come take a look at whatever maintenance you've been putting off. We could trade skills instead of money." Sadie felt something shift inside her ribcage, not the uncomfortable sensation of owing somebody a favor, but something else entirely, something that felt more like partnership than debt or obligation. "I'm on Maple, actually," Sadie said, and Elias leaned on his shovel. 3 blocks over on Oak, small world." She heard herself starting to say no automatically, then stopped. He wasn't asking her for anything. He was offering a trade. That was different. Sadie heard herself agreeing to this whole barter arrangement before the defensive part of her brain could shut it down, before the voice that had spent 5 solid years telling her not to let anyone in could remind her exactly why she'd built those walls in the first place. They finished redistributing the dirt pile, and Elias went back to his truck and unloaded the mulch he'd originally come to deliver, spreading it across the cleared beds while Sadie raked it level, And when his truck finally rumbled back out of the lot an hour later, Sadie just stood there in the middle of the garden, surrounded by fresh wood chips, trying to figure out why she hadn't done what she always did and sent him away the second he'd offered to help. She wasn't used to letting anyone help, had constructed her entire adult life around the principle of not needing that. But somehow, when he'd walked over with that shovel and just started working without asking permission first, or waiting around for her to be grateful, she hadn't told him to leave. The barter system they'd accidentally created turned into this routine neither of them had exactly planned, but both of them needed more than they'd admit. And over the next few weeks, Sadie found herself getting used to having someone else around, in a way that should have terrified her, but somehow didn't. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, Leo would show up at the band room after school with Elias trailing behind, always coming straight from his last sight of the day, still wearing his work vest and smelling like grass clippings and fresh mulch, and Sadie would set the kid up at the practice drum kit in the corner and spend 45 minutes teaching him basic rhythms while Elias sat in one of the plastic chairs meant for 7th graders and answered work emails on his phone. Leo had this natural sense of timing that you couldn't really teach, would pick up patterns after hearing them maybe twice, and Sadie caught herself actually looking forward to those sessions in a way she hadn't looked forward to much of anything in a long time. Leo spent Saturday mornings at his grandmother's, same as always, which gave Elias a window he'd started filling with Sadie's porch instead of sleeping in. He'd show up around 8 in the morning with his toolbox and an extra thermos of coffee, always too strong, that he'd started bringing for her even before she'd thought to ask for it. And he'd spend 3 or 4 hours replacing the rotted boards on her back porch, or fixing the gutter that had been hanging at a dangerous angle since last spring, or tackling whatever other maintenance disaster she'd been ignoring, because hiring someone wasn't in her budget, and learning to do it herself felt like more energy than she had to spare. They'd work in this comfortable kind of quiet, Sadie sanding down the new wood while Elias measured and cut, and the conversation would drift between complaining about shrinking city budgets and school board decisions that made 0 sense and the general challenge of keeping your head above water when you were doing it solo. Most of his weekday sites were clustered in the same 2 zip codes the school sat in, which was how he'd known the area well enough to find her street without directions. The district cut our arts funding again, Sadie said one Saturday while brushing wood dust off her jeans. They'd been working on the porch for maybe 2 hours and her shoulders were already feeling it. So now I'm buying drumsticks and reeds out of my own pocket because the kids can't afford them and the school sure isn't providing them. I spent $140 at the music store last week, and that's just going to be how it is, I guess. Elias was on his knees, securing a new board, and he didn't look up, but she could hear the frustration in his voice when he answered, "Yeah, the park system's the same deal. They cut our equipment budget by 30%, but somehow still expect us to maintain the same number of locations. I've been using my own tools for the past year because the city-issued stuff keeps breaking and they won't replace it." They fell into this pattern of trading complaints about bureaucracy and trading skills to survive it, and it felt less like charity and more like two people in the same boat deciding to row in the same direction, and Sadie started to feel her carefully constructed walls developing some cracks she wasn't entirely sure how to patch. Several weeks into their arrangement, Elias showed up on a Saturday morning with Leo in tow because his mother had a doctor's appointment and couldn't watch the kid, and Sadie waved them both toward the driveway where Elias's truck was parked with all his tools. "He can hang out while we work. I've got an old soccer ball in the garage if he wants to kick it around the yard," she'd said, and Leo had nodded seriously before finding a plastic paint bucket that was sitting by the garage door and flipping it upside down. Elias had unloaded his measuring tape and level, and was marking where the next porch board needed to go when Sadie heard it, this rhythmic tapping coming from the driveway that was way more complex than what any 7-year-old should have been able to pull off. She turned her head and saw Leo sitting cross-legged on the tailgate of his dad's truck, using 2 sticks he'd found somewhere to tap out this intricate pattern on the empty paint bucket, and the kid's face was completely focused, tongue poking out slightly between his teeth, while his hands moved in these precise, controlled motions. Sadie had been in the middle of sanding down a railing, but she just stopped and stood there watching, and something about seeing this kid completely lost in the rhythm made her face do something she hadn't felt it do in years, this soft, unguarded smile that spread across without her permission. She didn't say anything about it, just quietly went back to sanding while Leo kept drumming, but Elias had noticed her watching, and when he caught her eye a few minutes later, he mouthed, "Thank you." And Sadie had to turn away and pretend she was really invested in getting this piece of wood perfectly smooth, because the gratitude in his expression had hit her somewhere she'd thought she'd sealed off permanently. A few weeks after that, Sadie's 15-year-old sedan finally gave up completely, the transmission slipping worse every day that week until it just died in the school parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon and wouldn't turn over no matter how many times she tried the ignition. She'd gotten it towed to the mechanic she'd been using for years, and he'd called her the next morning with numbers that might as well have been in a foreign language for all the sense they made in relation to her bank account. Your transmission's shot. It's going to run you about 2,800 to replace. And honestly, even after that repair, this car's probably only got another year in it. You might want to start thinking about a replacement. The mechanic had said it sympathetic but matter of fact, and Sadie had thanked him and hung up, and then just sat on her couch staring at nothing because $2,800 wasn't something she could pull together, not with her mortgage and utilities, and the 100 other expenses that ate up her salary before she even saw it. She knew the math didn't make sense. Fix a car worth less than the repair, but a replacement meant a loan, and a loan meant more debt, and she couldn't face that right now. She ran the numbers 4 different ways, and they all came up the same. Completely impossible. And the worst part was feeling her hard-won independence starting to crack under the weight of something as stupid as car trouble. Her brain immediately went to worst-case scenarios. She'd have to ask her sister for money, and that would mean admitting she was struggling. Or she'd have to take out one of those predatory short-term loans and spend the next 2 years paying it off. Or she'd have to ask Elias for help, and that would fundamentally change what they had from partnership to something that felt too much like being rescued. And Sadie had promised herself 5 years ago that she would never put herself in that position again. The last time she'd let herself depend on someone completely, it had ended with her fiancé cleaning out their joint savings account and disappearing 3 weeks before their wedding. She'd talked to a lawyer once and been told there was nothing to recover. Joint accounts meant joint access, and she'd eventually accepted that the money was gone the same way she'd accepted everything else about that year, by grinding through it alone. She'd spent the next 2 years digging herself out of that financial and emotional hole, and she'd sworn on everything she had that she'd never be that vulnerable again. She'd called a rideshare both ways on Wednesday and watched $12 disappear from her account, knowing she couldn't keep doing that. That night, she texted Elias from her couch, where she'd been sitting since she got home, and she kept the message short, because if she wrote too much, she'd start explaining. And if she started explaining, she'd end up asking for help she absolutely could not ask for. "Hey, I've got too much going on right now. I need to handle some stuff on my own. Going to have to cancel Leo's drum lessons for a while. I'm really sorry." And she hit send before she could second guess it. 20 minutes later, she sent a follow-up, short and factual, confirming the lessons were done effective immediately so he wouldn't bring Leo on Thursday, only to find a locked band room. She hit send on that one faster than the first. She knew she was pushing him away, knew it was probably going to hurt his feelings, and definitely going to confuse Leo, who'd been making real progress. But the alternative was admitting she couldn't handle her own life, and that admission felt worse than anything. Elias was standing in his kitchen when his phone buzzed. He'd just gotten home from dropping Leo at school, and Leo had asked about her on the drive over, whether Miss Sadie was going to teach him a new pattern this week. He'd seen the text the night before, but hadn't known what to say to Leo yet, so he'd said, probably yeah, and hated himself a little for it. He was planning to grab a quick breakfast before heading to his first work site, and when he read Sadie's texts again, he felt his hands tighten around the edge of the laminate counter, hard enough that his fingers went numb. He'd read it enough times the night before to know there wasn't any other way to interpret it. She was cutting him off, pulling back, shutting down whatever they'd been building, and he recognized this move because he'd seen people do it before when they got scared of needing someone. His first instinct was to call her and demand an actual explanation, but something stopped him. Maybe the memory of how carefully she'd constructed her independence, or maybe just the understanding that pushing someone who was already running would only make them run faster. He set his phone face down on the counter and stood there in his kitchen trying to decide what to do next. And the apartment was quiet enough that he could hear the refrigerator humming, and the upstairs neighbor's footsteps, and his own breathing that had gone shallow and tight. This time he didn't chase her, didn't send a follow up text or show up at her door demanding to know what had changed. But he also didn't delete her number or write this off as another failed connection. He just stood there gripping his kitchen counter and thinking about what comes next when someone you're starting to care about decides they'd rather disappear than let you help them. Thursday morning at 6 a.m., Sadie was standing at the city bus stop 3 blocks from her house in weather cold enough that her breath came out in visible clouds, and she'd been out there maybe 10 minutes already, with the wind cutting through her jacket like it wasn't even there. She'd looked up the bus route the night before, figured out it would take her 40 minutes of standing and transfers to get to the school, and she'd set her alarm for 5:15 to make sure she had enough time. And now she was just trying not to think about how she was going to do this every single day until she figured out the car situation. Her hands were jammed deep in her coat pockets, and she was shifting her weight from foot to foot, trying to keep blood moving to her toes. And when she heard an engine slow down behind her, she didn't turn around, kept her eyes forward, told herself it was nothing. She'd half expected him to text back after she'd sent that message. He hadn't. What she hadn't expected was to hear a familiar engine slow down behind her. Elias's Parks Department truck pulled up to the curb about 5 feet from where she was standing, and he rolled down the passenger window, the early morning light barely starting to break over the buildings, and he leaned across the center console far enough that she could see his face. He didn't say anything at first, just reached over and flipped the unlock button so the passenger door clicked open, and then he settled back into the driver's seat with both hands on the wheel, waiting to see what she'd do. Heater takes a minute to warm up, but it beats standing in the wind. His voice was even and completely stripped of judgment, like he was just stating a fact about his truck's heating system and not offering her a way out of the mess she'd been trying to handle solo. Sadie turned her head and looked at him through the open window, and her first impulse was to say she was fine, that the bus would be here any minute, that she didn't need a ride, but her lips were already going numb from the cold, and her fingers were aching inside her pockets, and she was so incredibly tired of pretending everything was under control. She took 2 steps toward the truck and then stopped, her hand coming out of her pocket to grip the strap of her bag hard enough that the canvas bit into her palm. "I can take the bus." She said it quiet enough that he probably barely heard her over the truck's engine, and it wasn't really a statement. It was more like she was trying to convince herself that she still had other options, that accepting this ride wouldn't mean surrendering the independence she'd fought so hard to build. Elias didn't argue with her, didn't launch into some speech about how she was being stubborn or how he was just trying to help, didn't do anything except keep that passenger door unlocked and his truck idling at the curb while the heater started pushing slightly warmer air through the vents. He shifted the gear into park and just waited, both hands resting loose on the steering wheel, his eyes forward on the empty street ahead instead of on her, giving her the space to make the choice without feeling like he was watching her struggle with it. The silence stretched out for maybe 20 seconds that felt longer, and Sadie could feel her resolve cracking under the combined weight of the cold and exhaustion, and the reality that she'd been trying to do everything alone for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone just show up. She walked the rest of the way to the truck and pulled the door open, climbed into the passenger seat with movements that felt stiff from more than just the cold, and the interior was warm enough that her frozen hands started tingling painfully as blood flow returned. She pulled the door shut and sat there with her bag clutched in her lap, her whole body tense like she was waiting for him to say something about how she should have just asked for help, or how she didn't need to make everything so difficult. Elias put the truck in gear and pulled away from the curb, flipped on his turn signal, and merged into the almost non-existent early morning traffic, and for the first 3 blocks, neither of them said anything while the heater worked overtime and the radio played something too low to make out the words. "My car's dead. Transmission's completely shot. Mechanic quoted me $2,800 to fix it." Sadie heard herself say it, even though she hadn't planned to explain anything, the words just coming out, like pressure releasing from a valve that had been sealed too tight. I don't have that kind of money just sitting around, and I can't ask my family because that opens up a whole thing I don't want to deal with. So I was going to take the bus until I figured something else out. I wasn't trying to cut you off specifically. I was just trying to handle my own problems the way I always do. Her voice was doing something unsteady, and she hated it. Hated feeling this exposed. Hated that she was sitting in his truck at 6 in the morning, explaining her financial situation like he had any obligation to care about it. Elias kept his eyes on the road, and his voice came out measured and calm in a way that suggested he'd been turning it over since the moment he'd read her text. I know you were trying to handle it yourself. You've been handling everything yourself since I met you, probably way longer than that. But here's the thing, Sadie. I'm not here to fix your life, or solve all your problems, or whatever you think is happening. He took a left turn, and the truck's frame creaked slightly. I'm just not going to let you carry it by yourself when I've got two hands and a truck that runs. That's not me trying to rescue you. That's just what people do when they give a damn about each other. Sadie's hands were trembling in her lap, and she couldn't tell if it was left over from the cold or something else entirely. I can't pay you for rides. I can barely afford gas for my own car when it was working, and I can't keep teaching Leo for free if I'm also taking transportation from you. The whole point of the barter was that it was even. Elias pulled into the school parking lot and put the truck in park, but didn't cut the engine, turned slightly in his seat so he was looking at her head on for the first time since she'd gotten in. The barter's still even. You're giving my kid something I can't afford to buy him, and he's actually getting better at focusing because he's got an outlet for all that energy, and me driving you to work costs me exactly nothing because I drive past here anyway on my way to most of my sites, so we're not renegotiating anything. We're just adding a carpool to the existing arrangement. What if I can't fix the car for months? What if it takes me until summer to save up enough? Sadie's voice was barely above a whisper, and she was staring at her hands instead of at him. I can't be in debt to you for that long. I can't owe someone that much. You don't understand what that does to me. Elias was quiet for a second, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone softer, but no less certain. You're not in debt to me. You're in partnership with me. There's a difference. And yeah, maybe I don't fully understand why you're so scared of needing someone, but I can see that you are. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to pick you up every school morning at 6 and drop you here. And you're going to keep teaching Leo twice a week, and we're going to stop keeping score about who owes who what, because that's not what this is anymore. Sadie finally looked up and met his eyes, and hers were wet enough that she had to blink hard to clear them. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to let someone help without waiting for it to blow up in my face. I've spent 5 years making sure I'd never be in a position where someone else's choices could wreck me again, so forgive me if I'm not great at just accepting help like it's no big deal. Elias reached over and took one of her shaking hands in his. I'm not whoever did that to you, and I'm not going to disappear. And you don't have to trust me completely right now. You just have to trust me enough to get in this truck tomorrow morning instead of standing in the cold pretending you don't need anyone. 6 months went by in this gradual shift from survival to something that felt almost like actual living, and Sadie's car stayed dead in her driveway the whole time because every time she saved up enough money for the transmission, something else would come up: medical bills or house repairs, or the cost of existing in general. Elias picked her up every school morning at 6, and they'd drive to the school in comfortable silence or easy conversation, depending on the day, and she kept teaching Leo on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and watched the kid go from tapping random patterns to actually playing recognizable beats. Somewhere in February, she'd stopped dreading the morning rides and started looking forward to them, which was its own kind of terrifying that she chose not to examine too closely. By March, she'd stopped feeling like she was taking advantage and started feeling like maybe this was just what partnership looked like when both people were honest about what they could and couldn't carry alone. Spring came back around, and the community garden behind the school exploded into actual life. And one Saturday morning in early May, Sadie and Elias were back where they'd started, pulling weeds and spreading fresh mulch, while Leo sat on the tailgate of his dad's truck drumming on an old paint bucket he'd started keeping back there, with significantly more skill than he'd had 6 months ago. The kid had this steady, confident rhythm going, something he'd been working on in his lessons, and Sadie was kneeling in the dirt, planting tomatoes, while Elias spread mulch with the same shovel he'd used the day they met. They worked until almost noon and then took a break, sat shoulder to shoulder on the truck's open tailgate, with Leo still drumming nearby, sharing coffee from a dented thermos he'd been bringing for her since before she'd thought to ask for it. The garden looked completely different than it had back in October, actually alive instead of just functional, and Sadie was watching a small group of her band students who'd signed up for the Saturday garden club she'd started back in March, working in one of the beds they'd cleared together all those months ago. She leaned her head sideways until it rested on Elias's shoulder, the gesture feeling natural instead of forced, and her voice was quiet enough that Leo probably couldn't hear over his drumming. "I'm really glad you didn't let me do it alone. I would have told you I was fine handling everything myself, and I would have been lying through my teeth, so thank you for seeing through that." Elias wrapped his arm around her shoulders and took another sip of coffee that had probably gone lukewarm an hour ago. "You would have figured it out eventually because you're stubborn as hell. But yeah, it's better this way. Turns out two people splitting the weight makes everything easier. Who knew?" They sat there watching Leo drum and the garden grow and the morning stretch into afternoon. And Sadie thought about how 5 years ago she'd promised herself she'd never need anyone again, and how that promise had kept her safe, but also kept her at a distance from everyone who might have actually helped her carry it, and how sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone else carry part of the load when your arms give out. If this story reminded you that real independence doesn't mean refusing a steady hand when you're exhausted, stick around for more stories like this. Thanks for being here. And remember, the best relationships are built with calloused hands and honest hearts. Sometimes the person who shows up with a shovel when your wheelbarrow breaks is the same person who'll show up with a warm truck when your car dies. And that's not weakness. That's just what it looks like when two people decide to stop keeping score and start keeping each other upright instead.